Powerful theme in literature is the deception of people who probably should have known better. In the Bible, there's Eve being convinced that eating the fruit of the tree is in her best interests. In Virgil's Aeneid, the Trojans carry the gift of a wooden horse into their gates, thus sealing the fate of their impervious city by unwittingly bringing inside a group of Greek soldiers. In Shakespeare's Othello, a single misplaced handkerchief was all Othello needed to be convinced that his wife was unfaithful. And in Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, the protagonist convinces Ben Rogers, Billy Fisher, Johnny Miller, and a string of other boys just how much fun it is to paint a fence. And he even lets them pay for the privilege to do it. Many of us know people like Johnny Miller or Othello, people who are a bit too willing to believe. Does modern research support the idea that some people are more likely to be tricked or, for something less dramatic, convinced? The answer is an unequivocal yes. Returning to the attic model created for this course, the first T refers to characteristics of the target being influenced. Research indicates that some targets of influence are more suggestible than others. If you happen to be someone who's been called gullible in the past, or maybe you know someone who has, then knowledge and acceptance of that personal characteristics can help you escape being a victim of an influence expert with bad intentions like Bernie Madoff. In our last lecture, we discussed characteristics of agents that made them more likely to be able to influence. Now we're shifting to the target and examining what makes them more likely to be influenced. If you recall from the first lecture, Solomon Asch of Swarthmore College conducted a series of important experiments on social conformity. These experiments showed that people who found themselves amidst others who claimed something obviously false, line A there, that's the one that matches, they would sometimes go along with the group and say out loud things they did not believe. But some of the subjects in these famous experiments would even come to believe something that their eyes weren't seeing. Videos from the original Asch experiments show people truly doubting their own vision. And as mentioned in the first lecture of this series, some people are more likely to be concerned about and try to adhere to group norms. Those people are called collectivists. Collectivists value their connections with the group and will subsume their individual preferences and feelings to the good of the group. Collectivism varies across individuals and across cultures. Certain countries have cultures that promote a higher level of collectivism among their citizens. Countries with high levels of collectivism include Japan and Korea. Countries with low levels of collectivism include the United States, Canada, and Australia. At these extremes, we would observe differences in the way that participants behave in conformity experiments like Asch's. So the first target characteristic is the cultural characteristic of collectivism. Collectivists will be more likely to be influenced by others within their group in order to preserve harmony and consensus within the group. The second characteristic of targets that's relevant to persuasion is suggestibility. Suggestibility is basically synonymous with gullibility. It's a person's willingness to accept messages from self or others. In effect, it's the likelihood that something that is seen, heard, or felt will immediately be judged as true. There are actually a few different aspects or dimensions of suggestibility. One survey measure of it is called the Multidimensional Iowa Suggestibility Scale, MISS, or MISS for short. Created and owned by Professor Roman Kotoff as part of his doctoral work at the University of Iowa, it has dimensions that include consumer suggestibility, persuadability, peer conformity, and stubborn opinionatedness. These and other dimensions cover the various ways that information can come to a person and potentially influence him from the self, from peers, and from the media. Let's discuss the four dimensions I just mentioned in turn, along with sample questions that are included in the MISS questionnaire created by Kotoff and used in research. First, consumer suggestibility is how easily one is persuaded by messages from the media about products and services. People who score high in this dimension are generally influenced by advertisements and other things they see and hear in the media. Think about yourself as you listen to the following statements and rate yourself with a number from 1 to 5, where 1 indicates not at all like me, and 5 indicates very much like me. Here's the first statement. I often get information about products from commercials. Here's another statement for you to rate. After someone I know tries a new product, I'll usually try it too. So, how much do these two statements describe you? If you rated yourself as a 4 or 5, then you are relatively high on consumer suggestibility, and you may find yourself convinced to buy new products more often than other people. While consumer suggestibility deals with advertisements and commercials, persuadability is how easily one is persuaded by information provided by your peers. People high on this are more easily convinced by others' ideas. Again, let's rate ourselves on a scale from 1, not at all like me, to 5, very much like me. I can be convinced by a good argument. I get many good ideas from others. Now, it's certainly not a bad thing if you can be convinced by a good argument. I wish more people I worked with would be. But if you answered a 4 or 5 here, then you are relatively high on persuadability. Now we move to peer conformity. This is how often you conform to your friends and colleagues in order to fit in. People high on this dimension pay attention and generally conform to what people around them are doing. 2 more items. Rate yourself again, 1 being low and 5 being high. If you give yourself a 4 or 5, then you're high on peer conformity. My friends and I like the same thing, and I follow current fashion trends. The final dimension of suggestibility that I will discuss is stubborn opinionatedness. As reported by Professor Kotoff, this characteristic has a small but reliable negative correlation with the other dimensions that I mentioned. Having higher levels of this characteristic actually renders you less likely to be influenced by others. Rate yourself on these items. I question what I see on the news. I have strong opinions on most issues. If you gave yourself a high rating of a 4 or 5 on these items, then you are generally less suggestible than others. It's easy to witness stubborn opinionatedness in politics and in business. Perhaps the most classic example with the associated positive and negative effects is the late Apple founder and CEO, Steve Jobs. Jobs was known for having strong opinions and to fight with those around him to advance those ideas. It was his greatest strength and his greatest liability. By sticking to his vision of clean, simple, and well-controlled products, he pushed forward the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad, as well as the iTunes Store that supports them. Along the way, he and his company revolutionized one industry after another, pushing forward the graphical user interface in personal computing, digital music player, and the smartphone. The downside came from many people finding it hard to work for Jobs. When we think about his team trying to influence him as a target, things could get stressful. Jobs would argue and even yell. And many good people left the company because they could not take the stress and the feeling that Jobs' opinion mattered more than theirs. Fortunately, his ideas were good, so he and his company were successful. Let's review a study that examines how someone high in suggestibility differs from someone who is low on this characteristic. Martin Brunn and his colleagues from Ruhr University Bochum in Germany examined the relationship between suggestibility and acceptance in an ultimatum game. Before research participants played the game, they answered a portion of the suggestibility survey. Then they played. The ultimatum game is used in many decision-making studies and involves two players who interact to decide how they would share money given to them. The typical sequence goes like this. You are told that your partner is being given 10 money units. He offers you some percent of that amount. You can refuse, in which case no one keeps any of those units. Or you can accept, in which case you both keep the proposed sums. Now, more concretely in this study, let me walk you through what would happen if you were a subject. You would be seated at a computer screen and told to watch the screen. The screen would indicate that you and a partner, pictured and named on the screen, somehow find 10 euros on the street. Your partner picks it up and suggests how the money will be split. On the next screen, you can either accept or reject that offer. Again, if you accept, you're told you earn that money. If you reject, neither of you gets any money. At the end of the experiment, you are rewarded with an amount that reflects what you decided to keep during the game. So there is a real-world consequence in terms of the money you receive. As you might imagine, in this ultimatum game, a 50-50 split is considered fair, and everyone agrees. The interesting question is what happens when the proposed split is not fair, say 7-3. Your partner keeps 7 euros, you get 3. 8-2, or even 9-1. Are you willing to say no, even though it means you don't get anything, just because you think it's unfair and you don't think the other person should keep any money? In the study by Brun and colleagues, they found that suggestibility did not matter in the fair split condition. After all, everyone agreed when the split was 5-5. Suggestibility also did not really matter in the 7-3 split condition either. But in the most unfair situations, when the partner offered an 8-2 or a 9-1 split, people with higher suggestibility were much more likely than others to say yes to that ultimatum. In other words, those high in suggestibility were willing to acquiesce to what is clearly an unfair proposal. What would you do? In this study, only 16% of subjects agreed to the 9-1 offer, but the majority of that group were high in suggestibility. So the answer to what you would do probably depends on how you answered the questions that I posed to you earlier. If you were more suggestible, then you were more likely to take an offer, even if it is unfair. Let's think about this finding a bit more broadly. When an opportunity comes up to influence someone and you are the agent, how likely you are to succeed will depend not just on you, but on your target as well. If your target is more suggestible, then you're more likely to win, even if what you're asking isn't really fair. If your target is low on suggestibility, then you may not win, even if you are a master at wielding influence. This reinforces the idea that the success of influence is determined by multiple factors, and you cannot guarantee success every single time. So far, we've looked at two characteristics that make a target more or less susceptible to influence: collectivism and suggestibility. Now, let's turn to another important target characteristic: age. Why would age be associated with influence success? The reason is that both younger adults and much older adults are more susceptible to influence. Let's begin with kids. It's commonly believed that children and adolescents are poor critical thinkers and will be more likely to conform with their peers. This is why the answer to your question to your teen child, "Hey, if Bobby jumped off a cliff, would you?" may not be what you want to hear. Does research support the idea that younger adults are more likely to go along with their friends? Psychologists Lawrence Steinberg and Catherine Monahan, both from Temple University, examined how resistant people were to peer influence. For this survey, participants were given pairs of opposing statements and asked to pick which statement described them better. For example, which of the following two statements is more true of your behavior? Some people go along with their friends just to keep their friends happy, or other people refuse to go along with what their friends want to do, even though they know it will make their friends unhappy. The researchers administered the survey with many items like this, along with some other tests, to 3 different samples of people, totaling nearly 4,000 respondents, and they were diverse in all ways, including age. What they found was that preteens and teens were particularly less resistant to peer influence. In other words, they were not able to resist. Now, being able to resist influence began increasing in the teen years and increased gradually each year until about age 20, where it leveled off. So it appears that there really is something to the idea that the preteen and early teen years are filled with concerns about fitting in with peers, and they're more likely to comply. Leaving the kids behind, let's turn to older adults. Natalie Denberg and her colleagues at the University of Iowa and the University of Southern California were concerned about the rising number of fraud cases that appear to occur with older adults. We seem to see news stories every day about an older adult being taken advantage of by an unscrupulous salesperson, or maybe even by their relatives. Is it really the case that older adults are less able to detect lying and deceit? Denberg's work relies on what has been called the frontal lobe hypothesis of aging. This hypothesis suggests that as people age, changes occur in the prefrontal brain structures that undermine fundamental cognitive functions related to decision making. In some adults, these changes are disproportionately high. In the Denberg study, 3 groups were shown an advertisement for legacy luggage that had been reported as deceptive by the Federal Trade Commission. The 3 groups shown in the ad included a group of younger adults, age ranges from 26 to 55, a group of older adults with regular cognitive capacities, these were folks age ranges from 56 to 85, and then a group of older adults, same age, 56 to 85, but those who had been shown to have a common, often seen reduction in cognitive capacities, and this was judged by a separate task. 2 versions of the legacy luggage ad were shown, a full disclosure version and a limited disclosure version. Let me explain those 2. In the full disclosure version, the caption under the luggage read, "Legacy brings you the finest American quality luggage. After manufacture in Mexico, each piece is carefully inspected in Tennessee at our corporate headquarters before shipping to you." In the limited disclosure version, the same text was used with the exception of an omission of the phrase, "in Mexico." That particular wording was ruled by the FTC to be misleading, as it's likely to convey to consumers that the luggage is a product of U.S. origin. But recall, it was manufactured in Mexico and only inspected in Tennessee. How did the various groups do? With the full disclosure, all 3 groups picked up that the luggage was not actually manufactured in the U.S. In the limited disclosure condition, though, the older impaired group was significantly more likely to believe the luggage was made in the U.S. And as part of that study, the researchers asked about purchase intention. How likely would you be to buy this particular product? And with limited disclosure, the older impaired group had significantly higher purchase intentions than the other 2 groups. So older adults who are experiencing a natural decline in cognitive functioning are less likely to pick up on deceptive advertising, and thus more likely to be influenced to make a purchase. This makes older adults who are experiencing cognitive decline a target of choice for unethical agents. So far, we've covered collectivism, suggestibility, and age, both young and old. The last characteristic of influence targets that we'll talk about today is motivation. Motivation is a central element to the study of attitude change, how we go about changing our minds about something. For example, someone might have hated Apple computers, but over time come to love them, or used to think that Latin poetry was boring and then come to admire its austere power. Social psychologists have been studying attitude change for quite some time, and a number of useful theories have emerged. One of those is called dual process theory. As advanced by Richard Petty and John Cacioppo, this theory suggests that attitudes can change through either a central or peripheral route. Central routes are deliberate and effortful and occur when someone thinks carefully about a topic. The process here is that people collect information, deliberate, and then decide their attitudes towards that topic. Peripheral routes occur outside of attention and awareness. Typically, people change their mind via a peripheral route when something positive or negative is brought to mind while thinking about the topic. For example, if you aren't paying close attention because I'm telling you all about my latest textbook, then you might say great things about the book if I happen to be feeding you some fantastic snacks at the time. In the absence of attention, the positive experience of snacking while learning about my book may increase your positivity towards it. You in the mood for a little bite to eat? A now classic study examining central and peripheral processing was published in the Journal of Consumer Research in 1983. The study, by Petty, Cacioppo, and their colleague David Schumann, found that people's attitudes after viewing an advertisement could not be predicted solely by argument strength. That's the central route. Or by whether a famous endorser was used. That's the peripheral route. You had to consider whether people were motivated to pay attention. When people were made to believe that the information presented was personally relevant because they would be asked about it later, the strength of the argument mattered. Because people were motivated in that condition, they paid attention to the detail of the arguments. In this condition, having a famous endorser did not influence participants' attitudes toward the advertised product. But when people did not think the material was personally relevant to them because they were unlikely to have anything to do with what they were hearing, the argument quality didn't make a difference. Attitudes were the same whether the arguments were strong or weak, but famous endorsers did make a difference. In other words, when people aren't really paying attention, peripheral cues like endorsements make a big difference. When people are paying attention, they pay close enough attention to the argument that its quality matters. Now, if you haven't been paying close attention for the last few minutes, just know this. What I'm saying has been approved by Brad Pitt. Why the endorsement joke? As you've surely seen, product endorsements are commonplace advertising tools. Companies pay good money for them. One endorsement that I found particularly amusing was for the classic perfume Chanel No. 5. It pictured none other than a close-up of the handsome actor Brad Pitt. I'm fairly confident that Pitt doesn't wear Chanel, but clearly the executives at Chanel believe that pairing a handsome man with their brand is going to boost sales. And if people are skimming magazines and not paying much attention, it might just work. In the years since Petty and his colleagues published their paper, there have been new theories and new findings, but the basic idea is sound. People are generally less likely to be influenced by extraneous factors if they're motivated to pay attention to the real argument, the real features of the product, and so on. When targets are not motivated, they're more easily influenced via tactics that have little or nothing to do with the actual argument being used by the influencing agent. Have you ever considered why so many infomercials run on late-night TV? My first thought was that was the only time these companies could afford advertising. But TV sold merchandise is big industry, and there are actually entire channels devoted to it now. It turns out that one major reason to run late-night infomercials is that viewers are often tired, and thus more likely to be influenced to buy the next greatest thing because of its exhaustive and hard to remember list of amazing features. And the positive energy of the person selling surely helps boost influence through the peripheral route. Do I really need this new device? Who knows? But late at night, I'm more likely to be persuaded because I'm too tired to give my full attention. What we've been saying about age and motivation is further supported by a 2011 review by scholars, Guangxin Ji and David Bausch. Their review found that certain people are more likely to believe false claims in ads. Consistent with dual process theory, people who are either distracted or not motivated are more likely to be susceptible. The authors also find support for age as an important factor. Memory deficits in older adults increase the likelihood that a deceptive ad will be believed. In this lecture, we've discussed characteristics of targets that make them more susceptible to influence, including deceptive influence that we find in misleading advertisements. Of course, whether a particular influence attempt works will depend on other factors that we discuss in other lectures, such as the characteristics of the agent, the tactic, and the context. But all other things equal, the easiest person to influence is someone who is collectivistic, suggestible, either quite young or quite old, and someone not particularly motivated to pay close attention. This is incredibly important information to have. It can help you better understand if you or one of your loved ones is more likely to be influenced. Having that knowledge can help you thwart an influence attempt when it is against your best interest. What can you do to be less susceptible to influence, particularly if you discover you're prone to it? Stephen Greenspan, in his book, The Annals of Gullibility, offers 4 suggestions. First, he argues, make it a point to avoid acting impulsively. Don't make big decisions without sleeping on it. Second, design your own situations to avoid being pressured. Don't shop in stores with pushy salespeople, or just shop online instead. Third, accept that you don't know everything. By this, Greenspan, I think, is suggesting that you should be willing to ask lots of questions and do additional research before you believe a particular claim. Don't assume that what you have been given as information is all you need to know. Do additional research. And fourth, Greenspan encourages people to become more socially aware, paying careful attention to some of the characteristics and ploys of influence agents that have bad intentions. Consistent with Greenspan's suggestions, the first thing I will suggest for you to do as you reflect on this lecture is figure out if you are high on suggestibility. A short 21-item version of the MISS scale is available for free online. Take the test to find out where you rank on the various dimensions of suggestibility. If you're high, then you should be extra vigilant about overbuying or following friends into purchases that you don't really need. You should also be mindful. Be willing to walk away from a store before you choose to buy. And definitely don't shop when you're tired or hungry. The second thing I will suggest is particularly important if you're an older adult who's noticed a difference in your memory and processing speed. Now, this is something we should all practice regardless of age. Here is my advice. When you're about to make your next purchasing decision, step back. Take some extra time. If someone pushes you to make a decision quickly, you might ask, if you're really concerned with my best interests, then why are you in such a rush to close the sale? Before making big purchases or big decisions, get second opinions from people who have less of a vested interest in closing the deal. If you see something advertised and it appeals to you, do some secondary research in places like Consumer Reports before buying. In this lecture, we've discussed targets of influence and how it's important to consider them as part of any influence effort. In the next lecture, we'll get to the second T of the ADDIC model, and that's the really fun bit. We'll be talking about the actual influence tactics that we use to get our way.